you for being here, and to the people online. Well, this is a work that I've been doing with Brian Nolan for a while, working with the Wealth and Asset Survey. We've worked on that extensively in the few years that I was at INET, and then we've continued with that. And now we've always wanted to exploit the individual data that the survey has, right? This is a very good thing about the Wealth and Assets Survey in Great Britain, that it has individual wealth data collected at the person level and not at the household level. And that makes a big difference when you're talking about the gender wealth gap, because otherwise, in most studies, as we will see when we review the literature a little bit, they have to split most of the assets between the couple or the adults living in the house in a way that it's discretional and you really don't know. Whereas we have this individual data that it's only matched with the German socioeconomic panel data that's being used for the gender wealth gap. So, and well, as you can see, the presentation is titled The Gender Wealth Gap and the Role of Private Pension Wealth. There is also a part at the end in which I will talk about intergenerational transfers. At the time when I told Fiona about the presentation, this was a single paper with both things. We've now split that in two different papers, or prospective papers, also because, well, referees at a journal told us to do that before rejecting the paper. So, so I hope it makes more sense to talk about those things separately. But given it's a long seminar, I think we can do both, like mainly the gender wealth gap in pension wealth, but also we'll discuss the role of inheritances. So the gender wealth gap has been, because of this data availability issue that I was mentioning before, less studied than the income gender wealth gap. However, in recent years, both with this German socioeconomic panel and other household surveys in which you can focus on single-headed households to grasp that gender wealth gap, there's been quite a few papers coming up on this. And well, the main takeaway is that the gender wealth gap, it is significant. It is in percentage terms greater than the income wealth gap. So one can think that because wealth is to a great extent the accumulation of income over time, wherever there is an income gender gap, there will also be a wealth gender gap eventually, right? And it doesn't seem to be, as we will see at the end, connected with differences in the amount of intergenerational transfers received by men and women, but it may be, and it may be connected with the type of asset, something that we cannot look at with this data, but we can kind of hint that it's happening. And as for how the gap is decomposed, we will see that it's mainly driven by two wealth components, the financial and business wealth, and the pension wealth, which is in the work that we are presenting today, especially relevant because the UK has probably it is more relevant than in other countries because the private pension chunk of the pension system is greater than in other countries in which there is more public or statutory pension, which has less gender differences than the private pension has.
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Of course.
So are you saying with the last bullet point that it's not driven by inheritance schemes in that sense, or?
Yeah, we as we will see that the data don't show a great difference in the amount of inheritance that men and women receive, nor the probability of getting one.
Okay.
But then when you see how people that have received an inheritance compare with each other by gender, the gap is greater than among people who have not received the inheritance. So there seems to
Okay.
be some kind of thing going on there,
Mm.
which we can speculate because in this survey, we don't have good data about the type of asset received in the inheritance, but other people in other countries have contrasted that it seems to be that women tend to receive less productive assets, let's say.
Okay.
So in general, so that can influence that even if there is not a great difference in the amount or the probability of receipt, then it drives up to a greater wealth differences among receivers.
And so this is all within the UK.
Yes.
Sorry, I was a little bit late. But
Yeah. No, that
Okay.
what we will see today will be
Okay.
UK data.
Because there's Paula Gobi, who is in Brussels. She has an EUC grant on inheritance schemes, but that's mostly like economic history, in the sense that are there differences in I'm not sure how they're called, like whether the firstborn son gets everything, or it's evenly split across all the children, and how does it affect the generational wealth?
I'm sure that what we are seeing now in terms of this apparent equality in the inheritance receipt, it's a recent thing. One would think that before the inheritance scheme was much different for men and women, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And so I
Those
think
zero
those
to-
things can be consistent with each other. That historically it is like that, and now that there doesn't seem to be that difference. So as I was saying, that most of the studies studying the gender wealth gap have used household data, which means that you have to make some assumptions about how you split the assets. And well, one of the first works with US data found a 20% gap, taking men's wealth as a reference. That will be because of course the percentage can be different whether you take men. In general in this paper, and we'll discuss with men as an average, as a reference in the relative gap. Then other studies have used only single households and find something that we also find with individual data, that the gap grows at the top of distribution. When we talk about the average gap, of course, and in many distributional metrics that we use, then most of the average is driven by the top. And it's also the case in the gender wealth gap. And 25% wealth gap in Italy, women-based 20% if we use men wealth as a reference. And then there is this interesting work by Cook et al. Using household data, but then trying to infer individual data of within couples, within households, based on a machine learning matching of the characteristics that they do have for single people. So single-headed households present a pattern, and they try to apply, okay, well, if people in the ENA couple have this education level, income level, what would be the wealth that we would expect? So they split that in a better way than just splitting by dividing by 2, but it's still household data, right? It's not that you have collected directly that individual data reported by people.
And so the HSES is cross country.
Yes, that's the average 22% wealth gap was, or I think was 22, 24, was the average of the 14 countries that they studied. Then we have just a handful of studies that use individual data because of the problems to get that type of data set. One in France using the Patrimoine survey found a 12% gender wealth gap, not including pension wealth, and well, we will see that especially in the UK case, pension wealth makes a big difference. And then Sirminska, using the German SOEP data, found a 33% average wealth gap in 2012. In this case, using, as I said, individual data, but only with private pension wealth, not occupational pension wealth. I will repeat that later, but we have all types of private wealth in our survey, both the one you get from your employer and the one you may decide to pay on your own. And here is only private pension wealth. And then in Estonia, using a very good data set of admin data, they found a 31% gap. So most of, I mean, even in different countries, of course, all developed countries, we find this 1/3 type of gap in wealth and between men and women. And what we find here in this study, as we will see, is roughly is similar to that, even though a great chunk of that will be pension wealth, 29.5%, including pension wealth, but only 12.6%, closer perhaps to this estimate in France without using pension wealth.
So is it the idea that this is the difference in the money on the bank accounts of the individual people? Or
One part of that is the individual bank account, but it's also property.
Yeah.
It's all types of assets, stock.
But suppose I earn more than my girlfriend, we live together, but I decide to pay in the households a higher share of my income or
exactly. Yeah, in general, that might be it. I mean, most couples, I would say, perhaps split equally, at least formally. Then, and then when you are asked that in the survey, you would say half. It all depends. But then, second, property. I think, as we will see, of course, pension wealth is a very individual thing, and that is where we see a lot of the gap going on. Also, financial wealth. That it's and then, well, I have to say that we do have most of the data at the individual level, but not the main residence. That is the only thing that it's not asked who owns that in the survey. It is probably assumed that it's shared equally, and that's what we do. We split in that way. Okay, I already went through this, like this is all the types of wealth that we have: net financial wealth, business wealth, other properties that people may have, and pension wealth. This is all at the individual level. And then the main resident and its contents and vehicles and valuables like art, jewelry, those are collected at the household level. So, but they are not like the great components of wealth. And we will use two different samples. Most of the results that I will present are based on a broad group, including retired people as well, up to 85 years of age, from 30, from like the age that most people will have already a steady job. And then we will have in the second part of the presentation just an analysis of the working people, of the working population. So we will have only 30 to 65 years of age and not retired. So that way we can exclude pension in payment, which is a component that it's relevant. And then we do this because then we can focus on labor market characteristics of the people who are already working.
And what do you do with the payments into your pension scheme? Are they counted as debt at that moment, or do they count as assets as well?
They are computed using formulas of actuarial formula to calculate the expected overall pension wealth pot that each person has. That is done by the Office of National Statistics, and that is already provided in the data set. And well, the four types of pension in the UK are, well, the public pension, which is one that is particularly small compared to the private pension in the UK. The UK has one of the lowest replacement rates of the public pension system, which is how much of your average salary over your working lifetime you will get in your pension, in your public pension. It's very small. Of course, most people have occupational pension schemes, which are divided in two types. The ones that are defined benefit, in the sense that you, even though that is that change, for example, universities have that, and most public employees. And then what you get, it's like a monthly pay until you die, and that is, and you know that ex ante, even though it changes in the sense that sometimes the people who are managing the wealth of the pension wealth fund, they would say, well, we need to put a little more. I mean, employees need to contribute a little more,
Right.
or the employer, in order to keep what has been promised. But but you get like a fairly confident expectation of what you will get. These type of plans are decreasing in the UK, and there's most of the new contracts go with a defined contribution plan, in the sense that what is defined is what you contribute, and then what you get depends on how well the market goes and how well the pension fund is managed.
Yeah.
We will see, and I anticipate that the wealth gap is greater in these type of plans, because these are probably done by companies who have more equal salaries and public companies than this one. So it's not, I would say, it's not the plan itself, but the type of job that is associated with that. Also, it may be that in these ones, that's a speculation, but we will see in the last part that there is a difference in the pension management knowledge that men and women claim to have. So women on average tend to say that they know a little less about how to manage the pension, and that could go to taking like more safer plans,
Right.
but that is something that we can only hint from the data.
So what's the public pension pillar? How much is it roughly of your last income? Just out of
I don't. I mean, there's OECD data that I checked when we were writing the working paper. I think the UK was low. I don't want to say anything
Okay.
too out of line. Probably 25% or 30%, and so which is like
Okay.
or maybe a little bit more, but it's far from what you get. Like, I don't know, Spain or Italy get like 70-80%,
Yeah.
because they do not have these occupational
Exactly,
plans as
yeah,
well.
so-
Germany, on
yeah.
the other hand, has a very strong occupational plan that is sometimes sort of mandatory. So that would be, but the strictly speaking, the public one is smaller and weaker in the UK. And this is the main result that I already mentioned, right? The wealth gap of 12.6%, 12.4% for the overall population, without including pension wealth, and 29.5 including pension wealth. This gap is greater in coupled households than in single households, both with and without pension wealth. And this is just the absolute values. Like you can see that the difference is roughly at 100,000 on average. Of course, bear in mind that this is driven by the top, like that is an average. The median has a small gap of a few thousands only, right?
But it's mostly the case that women are not worse off. It's really men that are better off. So if you compare across the outcomes, it's at least at the average, women have around 300,000. So there's no big difference in terms of whether you're a couple or single or.
You're right. It is that married men tend to have a much greater wealth than that it's. I hadn't noticed that. So it's
but it's not the same on the median side, right? Because there seems that the single women are worse off. Yeah,
in this case, yes. Yeah, one would also. One has, this is not single people who have never married. It can also be widowed people. So
okay, I see.
So that might be also why, given the higher life expectancy of women, in this case, we may get that coupled women also get part on average, of course, a greater part of the partner.
Do you know anything about people who have been unemployed for a long time?
We see that in the last part in the analysis. We have a descriptive table. I don't remember, but we will see it about how, and there is a higher prevalence of people with a very long career break among women, which in our decomposition explains a big part of the gap, and also part-time jobs. This is very consistent with all the papers that have studied that. So the labor marketplace plays a big role. And well, we can see that among couples, the gap increases with age, including pension wealth, which makes sense, right? Pension wealth is accumulated over time. It's not the same excluding pension wealth, which may be related to that what I said about widowed people probably getting the wealth. And so couples without pension wealth, they tend to narrow the gap over time. And well, the good thing about the data is that, well, what I presented before was just the last wave, like the most recent data we had, the 2018, 2020 wave of the survey. Here we have the gap in absolute value, the average wealth gap in pounds in 2020 British pounds. And we can see that over time, this blue line is the total wealth gap. That has been increasing. But if we look at which components have increased, we see that it's only two of them that have this upward trend, which is pension wealth, which is a big part of total wealth, and financial and business wealth. Main residence and other property and physical wealth, which I have aggregated here, the gap is very small, right? And it hasn't changed much.
Also because you kind of impose it by saying it's half-half.
Yeah, for this, you're right. The main residence.
Yeah.
I mean, you also have single households that could have that are also, but most of the survey is composed by households in couples. But also, I mean, it's not obvious that other property would be that way. But in that case, it is. It seems that even when households buy a second house, it's normally split equally. So there's and that doesn't happen with financial wealth and pension wealth.
So is it that the pension gap is mostly driven by the type of career that the man has compared to the woman? I mean, that has to be.
It has to be, at least in terms. I mean, the decomposition that we do at the end is only for this part, for pension. But we could have done that also for financial wealth to see to what extent labor market, like part-time, career breaks, average income could influence that. And it would explain a lot of that. For example, the pension wealth gap with the variables that we use, it's 45% explained by the labor market characteristics, and there's probably other things that we cannot get in the capture in the data, right? And there's also the interaction. This is like we will do the Osaka blinder decomposition in which we get like the endowments part, and there's also an interaction part that we cannot interpret very well, but it would also be there.
Okay, so here the pension gap, it's the accumulated proportion of income, of different income between women and men.
Yeah, I mean, it can also be because they decide to put a greater share of that income in the pension plan. So it's not only the income per se, but also how you invest it, what the Office of National Statistics has is like people say, okay, what is your contribution to the pension plan? How much is the pension? What is the value of the pension plan right now? And then given the age of the person, they apply the formulas that the pension funds also apply, and they calculate like a pension wealth for each person. Probably, I mean, given on the contribution, which as you say, is very much dependent on the salary, but also on the decisions that you make about, also some people may have like other wealth that they not coming from salary, maybe rents that they can put in the pension plan as well. But for the most part, I would say it's related to the wage. And this is the difference between the first and the last year that I showed, just going from the first to the last, the components, right? As we see that, like, there's even like the main residence, there's even a difference in favor of women, and then other property small, and then pension has grown and financial wealth gap has grown between 2008 and 2020, all in 2020 British pounds. Then we have a look at how is this across the distribution, right? Is the in deciles. We cannot go farther than this because it's survey data. We don't have those many observations, right? To look at the top 1%, things like that. But with estimating the quantiles at each decile, and this is total wealth, one would see that the gap at the median is what we saw, like a few, probably 20,000, and then there's not even a significant difference. But then as you go up, especially in the 8th and 9th and probably further up, then the gap it's wider, and that's what drives the average wealth gap, right? And it has increased over time, especially at the top.
Do you have any reference how this compares to other studies? Like, suppose, is there any survey bias in the sense that you could see?
I mean, the only thing that this survey, not the survey itself, but the UK data are different from the other one. One of the things is this the greater importance of pension wealth.
Exactly.
And so, and there's all other studies that have individual data, but I don't think they have so many ways as to see the trends. Like, for example, the
HFCS, for instance.
household data.
Yeah.
You could do it, but it wouldn't. For the gender wealth gap, I mean, it's very good for most things, but because it is a thing that happens also a lot within households, they could think about having individual data at some point. The thing is that it's more difficult and expensive to collect, because then you cannot just talk to one person and say, okay, tell me what the household has. You have to
sit down together.
To sit down with one and the other, right? And then pension wealth, just one component of the total wealth, the same picture, right? And financial wealth, the same, even though, well, the brackets are greater, but I mean, we can be quite confident. Why is this? Because even though the survey it has a large sample, not many people have business assets or financial wealth. Even though people at the top would think that everyone invests and has stocks, but then it's not like that. And we can see here like 0, 0, 0, nearly 0, and even here you get like a few observations. So that's why the confidence intervals are larger. I don't show the other ones because they didn't show that thing. The main residents, they were mainly flat. Of course, you would see for the main residents that even the gap in favor of women has increased a little bit. I mean, it looked big, but then if you look at the axis, it was like small. And now we switch from this big group in which we had also people up to 85 years old to only active population in the working age, right? From 30 to 65. That implies that this pension in payment component is taken out because, well, when you are retired and you respond to the survey, then they don't tell you what plan do you have because you're already getting your pension. So they tell you what is your payment that you have, and then based on life expectancy, and they calculate the pot, right? So for this pensioning payment, we don't know. One thing we also remove it from the analysis that we will do now is that we don't know which type of plan, DB or DC, originated the pensioning payment. And then, of course, the gap is this is 100,000 and this is 60,000. So it's the same. It looks the same, but this is smaller, of course, because we have removed pensioning payment. And this is the analysis from 2008 to 2020. And we see that we've been saying, oh, pension wealth gender gap has increased, but it's mainly due to this component, the defined contribution pension plans that I was mentioning before, not the defined benefit or, well, personal pension either, right? The private one that you do, like, beside the one that you have at work. So we can see total pension wealth, also an increase, of course. we have reduced the sample, then there is not, that we have a greater confidence intervals, but you can still see that the red mark is above the blue one, not for defined benefit, in which, well, they are statistically the same. It hasn't changed even at the top of the distribution, but it does have a very significant difference in defined contribution pension wealth plan. So one takeaway that we can infer from this work is that as many pension schemes are moving from DEB to DC, greater gender wealth gap in pension wealth can be expected, because those plans reflect more the differences in the labor market than the other ones, which tend to even out all these differences in income. So now we employ this Osaka blinder decomposition, in which we will split the gap in the endowments part, which is the gap driven by the difference between group A men and group B women in the endowment of the variables, like in this case, how many of them have a permanent job or a part-time job. We use dummies for this. How many have a DB plan as a dummy? And of course, that implies that the other people have a DC plan. How many of them are part-time? What is the income? And then we have a few interesting questions about risk attitudes, pension literacy, so to say, and saving attitudes, right? Which I can anticipate they're not very relevant in this case. Only the risk management knowledge question. And then we have the unexplained part, which is, of course, it's like the difference in the coefficients, right? In the B star is the coefficient of a pooled regression of men and women together, and this would be like the coefficient only for women and only for men. And then in this case, it's the interaction between the endowment of whatever labor market variable that we analyze and the difference in the coefficient. So it's harder to explain, and that is why sometimes in this literature it's called the unexplained part, but it is something that is not that is unexplained. It's just that it's not easy to explain just with the endowments that the two groups, men and women, have. And these are like these descriptive attitudes that you were asking me about before, for example, or long-term out of work. So this is, I think we made a split like 5 years. Who had taken more than 5 years out of the labor market? 31% of women in 2008, in the wave of in 2008, 2010 have done it, and only 8% of men. And this has increased for both in the last round of the survey, but a little bit more for women. Saver attitudes, the same. That the question was like, do you prefer to buy on credit or to pay in one go? Most people, and there is no difference. And then the decomposition shows that it doesn't affect part-time job. Great difference, 6.6% for men, 46% people have had a part-time job as a main job or one of the main jobs in their career, and it hasn't changed much in these 12 years. So that is something that it's in one of the main issues now when women are accessing the labor market more and more. There's still a huge gap in part-time jobs, and not only in the UK. Then the Greek qualification, not great differences. Both have increased in this, of course, in these 12 years. Like education, higher education has been more widely available for both genders. Women tend to have less of a manager or high professional job, a little less, 52 and to 45. DB main plan favors women. More women tend to be as a share of women in a defined benefit plan. and also in a public sector job. We will see that these two variables tend to cushion the gender gap. So they have a negative coefficient when we explain the gap. And then pension knowledge has a difference as well. So how would you say your knowledge is about your pension management? And men say good or very good in a 65% of cases, whereas women only say it in 60% of cases.
So you're going to look at the decomposition variable by variable here, right?
Yes.
So, because I was wondering, I can imagine there's a story that connects those together, right? So if you are in a lower page job or you don't have managerial responsibilities, it's cheaper to go part-time, because otherwise if the husband should go part-time, you lose a larger part.
Yeah, we look at all of them, but they are estimated in the same equation,
Okay.
but then you can get the separate coefficients for each of them. So some of the interactions, or at least the like collinearities that they may have, are taken into account, even though we are not interacting them.
Okay.
So let's look, of course, age is more or less the same. And let's look at the results. This is what we don't explain. And okay, let's start by what is the gap? It is on average, this is pension wealth gap only. We're looking at pension wealth. It's 62,000, and it's 164 for men, 101 for women on average. Of course, we know that this is driven by the top people. Not everyone has 100,000 or 164,000 pension wealth bought, but on average the gap is 62. Of that, and this is just for the last round, right? There were not much changes in terms of the weight of each variable between 2008 and today. So this explains 43% of the gap. So this amount here. So the sum of these coefficients is this. Some of them are negative, and the remaining part, the sum of this, taking into account that there is a constant, that is what makes it hard to interpret that is negative, but this amount for the remaining part, 57%. So pension knowledge explained 5,000 of these 62,000 of the gap, which is relevant. It's almost 10%. Part-time work even more. Being self-employed also, and degree qualification, no. Long-term out of work as well. It explains the gap. These two variables cushion the gap, so the gap would be greater if women and men had the same prevalence in public sector job and DB plans, which in this case they were more prominent for women, so that is why they have a negative coefficient. So we can say that our data and our analysis kind of corroborates what other works have pointed out, that most of the wealth gap, or not most, but a great part of the wealth gap in pension is driven by labor market characteristics, right? This is valuable as a study because it's probably together with the German socioeconomic panel, and I think the latest data that's being used it's relatively old, 2012, in which they are listed. I don't know if they are not asking individual questions anymore, or probably the works haven't been published yet. And also this Estonian study with individual data, but this would be one of the handful studies that use most individual data, apart from the main residents. And we see that, well, the wealth gap without pension is 12.6, and it booms to 1/3, almost 29.5, when pension wealth is included. And there's been an increase between the first wave of the survey and the last wave of the survey, driven mostly by the top part of the distribution, business wealth and pension wealth. And when we analyze the pension wealth gap, we've seen that having a good job, like managerial job, not having career breaks, not having part-time jobs, of course, income as well, and pension management knowledge are accounting for a big deal of that pension wealth part. And it would be even greater if women didn't have more DB and public sector pension plans. So this trend to decrease defined benefit pension plans may increase the pension wealth gap across gender in the future. Okay, now I think that would be good enough for the seminar. And I know you all the audience are tired, but as I was saying at the beginning, when I sent it to Fiona, we were doing this work also with inheritances. So, and that was in the headline of the talk. So I thought, okay, let's add it up. We had to split it into different papers, but now, so I'll tell you a little bit about inheritance and the gender wealth gap. In this case, we only can use the first 3 waves of the wealth and asset survey, because the wealth and asset survey, for some strange reason that we've been telling them to fix, only asked, except for the first wave, in which they asked, well, have you received an inheritance recently? And have you received an inheritance ever? And then you can, well, add it up.
Yeah.
But because they thought of the survey as a panel, which is not, because there's so much attrition that you can only go 3 waves, otherwise you lose. There's a lot of replacement, so they should keep asking to the new people for inheritances ever, but they don't. Maybe they will in the future again. So we can only add up to 2012, the first 3 waves, which is people who have survived in the survey from wave 1. So we know inheritances ever in the past and the recent ones. So we aggregate all that, we update it, we update it, but because, well, the ones received in 1985, they're more valuable now. And then we can see this is the percentage receiving, that men and women more or less receive the same in like 23, even a little more for women. Not a big difference across age groups. Of course, as you get older, you are more likely to receive an inheritance, and the same for inheritances and gifts. And for the amounts, there is a slight difference in favoring men, but not much, almost the same, right? Even when gifts and inheritance. So that's why I was saying, well, we don't see on average like a gap in the probability of receiving an inheritance and on the amount. But then when we put the people that do not receive an inheritance, men and women together, there is a wealth gap. But when we put the people that receive an inheritance together, the gap is greater. Of course, this might be driven also by age, because people and the wealth tends to grow, and also the gap. So we'll do an analysis now controlling for age, but on just but we also not without a regression, you can also see across age groups that it tends to be greater, the gap, even within the same age group, for people who have inherited. So what's going on? Because, well, they don't seem to inherit more men than women, but then when you look at the wealth that they have across inheritors, there seems to be a wider gap. And then we look at, well, what type of wealth is driving that? I only pictured this, the 2 types that show the difference. Pension wealth, which has already a gap, but it's slightly bigger for those inheriting, mainly, as I was saying, also in this case, probably driven by age. And then financial wealth, in which there is a much larger, in relative terms, increase between those who do not inherit and those who do. Then the gender difference increases a lot. And well, given that we don't see a difference in the amount, it must be the type, but we cannot look at that because there is not a good question. There's a lot of missing in the replies in this first wave about what did you inherit. So, but there's been other studies, in particular, well, one in France by Céline Bessière, that they look at, well, they go to the notaries and they do a sort of quantitative but also qualitative study, and they look at, and then and across even, well, wealthy people, who are those who have a greater amount to pass to their children, men tend to get the business, men tend to get the stocks, all the wealth that produces more wealth. and women tend to get either housing property or money, which is harder to build up as more wealth. And I think that is probably the story behind this. And when we look at this controlling for age, education, income, and marital status, well, this a gap. It doesn't go down much. This is, well, this would be like we put a dummy for in receipt, and this is what the dummy accounts in a simple estimation, which is just, in this case, is just difference, right? If you do an OLS without any other variable, then the dummy receiving an inheritance, the coefficient gets like the difference between the two groups. But then when you control for all these things, it's still a significant gap. In main residence, the gap favors women, also in other property, and then the gap in financial and business wealth, even if you control for a lot of things, still the coefficients for men and women are significant. Whereas for pension, once you control for this, even though you get an amount, we cannot trust it because then the women's coefficient for the gap is not significant. So I would say that can point out at that pension wealth gap growth for inheritors being driven only by age, whereas this one must be something else because it's still significant for both groups, even controlling for all this. And well, that's unfortunately, we don't have this very relevant data about what did you inherit. So that is something that the ONS should be. I think they are rebuilding the wealth and asset survey. Well, I don't know if they're rebuilding it in a good way because it's also driven by budget constraints. So they will reduce the sample, but they will rethink the questionnaire, and maybe given the prominence that inherited wealth is getting now, right? We know that there's a huge amount of wealth that will be transferred in the near future, and that a question about what are people inheriting will be probably very interesting to deepen in this analysis in the future. So I don't know if there's any other question, or maybe online. I don't know if people are online and want to ask something, just talk.
I have one more question.
Thank you.
Given what you know, is there anything that you can say from a normative side? Would you think about restructuring pensions, or would you? Is it important to tackle the gap, and if so, how?
I mean, I think both. There's one thing that I can say besides the gender wealth gap, which is that moving from defined benefit pensions to defined contribution pensions is not a good thing for the employee. It's more uncertainty. It's less redistributing, and that is something that, of course, it's easier for the pension plan management teams and funders to deal with, but we will see the effect of that in the future, right? Yeah. When, I don't know, when you're in a defined benefit, things can be done, and the employer can be asked to, okay, you promised this, then you need to step up, but with a defined contribution one, you're more subjected to the events in the market, right? So, and then if we look at the group who's more can be more affected by that, it's women, because they tend to contribute less, have less steady jobs than some. So I think that is a debate in England now, that what kind of pension reform they need to do in a way. I mean, it's okay as long as you have almost full employment and everyone has an occupational plan, that is fine. But I don't think that is the case, and people are getting. I don't know. I talk to people who are like, well, I'm rejecting the pension plan, and I don't want to. Well, not many people. I think if you think it over, but it's in the defined benefit ones, they take a lot, and then you don't see it. But you have to think that an annuity for life is much safer than just getting 40,000 in one go, which you don't really know how much that is going to last. I think governments should be more forward-looking and think for the people in this
Yeah,
case.
okay.
I don't think we are all, I don't save as much as I think I should save. And not, and so, yeah, and I work on these things. So someone should take care of these biases that we have for the present. And that is pretty obvious, but of course there's a lot of, there might be some financial interest in going in a more privately funded way of financing pensions. And that is affecting those who are bad in the labor market, whether men or women, but women tend to be in worse condition on average in terms of how steady the job is, career breaks, part-time, in average income, etc.
I was wondering if we can maybe think in any kind of influence of the Great Recession in your results. Because, for example, if we saw this increase from 2008 and 2020, so maybe
You're right, you're
maybe
right.
it's something that could have an
Yeah.
influence, especially at the top of the distribution, maybe, or
I think that is something I should have mentioned, because if we go back to the graphs that have the trend, no, this one here, you're right that this in the recession thing, nothing happened, right?
that's true.
Until 2014.
That's true.
So, I mean, we don't have data before the Great Recession, which could help us probably figure out if maybe the wealth gap is returning to the steady state that it had before the recession. We unfortunately cannot check that, but it's true that, well, both in, of course, as long as there is more like differences in wages and financial wealth and pension wealth, it all happened after 2010 and mostly after, in terms of pension, after 2014. But this is the gap.
Yeah.
And I think it has to do with the recession also, but then because these years have seen this trend in shifting from defined benefit to defined contribution plans.
That's very interesting. Thanks.
Okay,
There's no
thank you.
Probably.
Yeah, I think we can finish now.
Like there are some questions or something.
No